The 42-year-old businessman never imagined that a simple morning commute would destroy the perfect life he had built. Stopped at a red light, he saw through the tinted glass a woman at the bus stop, holding the hands of identical twins who carried his DNA in every feature of their faces. Robert Williams adjusted his Italian silk tie while his driver navigated through the chaotic traffic of Manhattan's financial district. It was an ordinary Thursday morning in March, the kind of morning that promised to be forgotten among meetings and million-dollar contract signings. The Mercedes air conditioning maintained the perfect temperature, isolating him from the humid heat that was already punishing the city at 8 in the morning. His fingers drummed on the leather seat, a nervous habit he had developed in recent months since business had begun demanding increasingly risky decisions. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from his wife, Catherine, reminding him of that night's charity dinner. Catherine Williams, heiress to one of New York's most traditional families, had transformed their 15-year marriage into a partnership that transcended love. It was an alliance of power, influence, and meticulously maintained appearances. Robert reread the message about the dress she would wear, the important guests who would be present, the generous donation they would make to maintain their image as an exemplary couple. It was when the red light forced the car to stop at the corner of 5th Avenue and 42nd Street that his world began to crumble. Through the window, just a few meters away at the bus stop crowded with hurried workers, he saw her, Julia. The name resurfaced in his mind like a wave breaking against rocks. Julia was there, 5 years older, her black hair now with premature silver streaks, her face marked by the exhaustion he recognized well, the exhaustion of someone who fights alone. But it wasn't Julia who made his heart stop. It was the two boys beside her. Twins, clearly. They must have been around 7 or 8 years old. They wore simple school uniforms, worn backpacks on their backs, scuffed sneakers on their feet. One of them laughed at something his brother said, throwing his head back in a laugh that Robert recognized immediately. It was his own laugh, recorded in home videos from his childhood that his mother still kept. The other gestured animatedly, his hands cutting through the air with the same intensity Robert used in his presentations to investors. The light remained red, but for Robert time had stopped completely. His breathing became shallow, his chest tight, as if the air conditioning had sucked all the oxygen from the car. His hands began to tremble slightly, and he hid them under his thighs, a childish gesture of someone trying to hide their own vulnerability. The driver said something about traffic, but Robert didn't hear. His eyes were fixed on those faces that were mirrors of his own, living proof of a past he had buried with the same efficiency with which he buried competitors in business. Julia adjusted one of the boys' backpacks, that maternal gesture so natural it hurt to watch. She hadn't changed in that aspect, always careful, always attentive to details. Robert remembered how she used to straighten his tie in the mornings when they were still too young to understand that love wasn't enough when you came from different worlds. She, daughter of immigrants, working since she was 15. He, heir prepared from birth to take over the family business. Their relationship had been a well-kept secret for 3 years. Meetings in discreet apartments, trips to cities where no one knew them, whispered promises of a future both knew was impossible. When Robert's father discovered, the ultimatum was clear. End it with her or lose everything. Robert chose everything, or so he thought. The light turned green, but Robert knocked on the partition glass, asking the driver to stop. His hands sweated as he opened the door, the hot, humid city air invading his climate-controlled refuge. Each step toward the bus stop seemed to cross quicksand. People passed hurriedly, bumping into him, but Robert barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on Julia, who hadn't seen him yet. When he was less than 5 meters away, one of the boys, the one gesticulating animatedly, turned and looked directly at him. The impact was physical. It was like looking at a photograph of himself at 8 years old, except for the eyes, which were Julia's, deep brown with golden flecks that captured the light. The boy tilted his head, curious about this expensively, dressed man who stared at them with a strange expression. Julia followed her son's gaze and her eyes met Robert's. Recognition was instantaneous, followed by a succession of emotions that transformed her face into a canvas of conflicting feelings. surprise, which quickly transformed into something harder, more protective. She instinctively pulled the boys closer, her body creating a barrier between them and Robert. Robert opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "What do you say after 8 years of silence? How do you explain the inexplicable?" His throat was dry, words trapped somewhere between guilt and fear. Julia, for her part, kept her chin raised, her eyes steady, a posture that said everything without needing words. She had survived without him, raised the children without him, built a life without him. One of the twins tugged at his mother's sleeve, asking something Robert couldn't hear. Julia answered quietly, still without looking away from Robert. The bus arrived, braking noisily. People began to board. Julia guided the boys toward the door, but before entering, she turned one last time. Her lips moved, forming words that Robert read clearly. "They are yours." The bus departed, leaving Robert standing on the sidewalk, his impeccable suit now seeming like useless armor against the truth that had just hit him. People passed, some looking curiously at this man clearly out of place, frozen in the middle of the busy sidewalk. His phone buzzed insistently in his pocket, Catherine probably asking where he was. The 9 o'clock meeting, which should define the purchase of a rival company, suddenly seemed absolutely irrelevant. Robert returned to the car like an automaton. The driver asked if everything was okay, noticing his boss's sudden pallor. Robert just nodded, unable to articulate words. During the trip to the office, his mind worked frantically, calculating dates, remembering the last meeting with Julia. That final argument, where she begged for them to stay together, and he chose cowardice disguised as pragmatism. The office on the 30th floor offered a panoramic view of New York, but Robert saw nothing beyond those two faces. His secretary, Marina, brought coffee and the day's agenda, but he barely registered her presence. His hands still trembled slightly when he picked up the phone, then put it down. Call whom? Say what? The morning passed in a fog of meetings where Robert was physically present but mentally absent. His partner, Charles Mendoza, noticed the distraction and made a point of mentioning it during the meeting with Japanese investors. An apparently casual comment about Robert seeming out of focus that didn't go unnoticed by those present. Charles had always been a shark sniffing blood in the water, and Robert had just cut himself deeply. During the executive lunch at the club, Robert barely touched his food. The 18-year-old whiskey tasted like ashes. Influential businessmen talked about politics, economics, their children at American universities, and Robert smiled and nodded at the right moments, an actor playing the role of himself. But his mind was at that bus stop, on those simple school uniforms, on the fierce pride in Julia's eyes. At 3 in the afternoon, Robert cancelled the rest of his appointments and asked his private driver to do a discreet search. In 2 hours, he had the address. Julia lived in a middle-class neighborhood in Queens, worked as a nurse in 2 hospitals. The boys studied at a public school that ranked among the top 10% in the city for academic performance. Cold data that said nothing about sleepless nights, childhood fevers faced alone, birthdays where the question about their father was delicately sidestepped. Robert passed by Julia's modest house 3 times before creating the courage to stop. It was a simple but well-maintained townhouse with a small garden in front where children's bicycles rested against the fence. The normalcy of the scene was both comforting and terrifying. There was the life that could have been his if he had chosen differently. When he rang the doorbell, his hands sweated so much he discreetly dried them on his pants. The woman who answered, not a maid, but Julia's mother, older but still recognizable, widened her eyes upon seeing him. Mrs. Carmen had always treated him with a mixture of distrust and hope, as if she knew he would break her daughter's heart, but wished she was wrong. Julia appeared in the hallway, still in her hospital uniform, the exhaustion of a 12-hour shift evident in every line of her face. She stopped upon seeing him, then approached slowly, like someone approaching a dangerous animal. She didn't invite him in. They talked right there at the doorstep, words coming out slowly, painful like glass shards. The boys were named Luke and Gabriel, 8 years old, born premature, spent a month in the NICU. Julia discovered the pregnancy 2 weeks after the breakup. Tried to call, but Robert's number had changed. The office informed that he was on an indefinite business trip. She understood the message. Her father died of heartbreak a year later. Those were the exact words she used, heartbreak, as if it were a real disease that could be listed on a death certificate. Robert listened to everything in silence, each. A revelation, an additional weight on his shoulders. When he offered financial help, Julia laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. She didn't want his money, never did. She survived 8 years without him, would continue surviving. But the boys had the right to know their father, however bad he was. These words, said without anger but with brutal honesty, hurt more than any accusation. They arranged a meeting for the following Saturday. A public park, neutral territory. Robert left there with shaky legs, drove the car himself. He had dismissed the driver and stopped at the first isolated place he found. There, alone in the car, with his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, he cried for the first time in 20 years. Not discreet tears of a controlled man, but sobs that came from deep in his chest, years of repressed emotions finally finding escape. That night's charity dinner was an announced disaster. Catherine immediately noticed something was wrong. 15 years of marriage had taught her to read every micro-expression of her husband, and what she saw now was a man in tatters, desperately trying to maintain composure. During the cocktail hour, Robert drank more than usual. During dinner, he barely touched his food. During the charity auction, he made absurd bids on items he had no interest in, as if money could buy absolution. Catherine waited until they were in the car, returning home, to confront him. Her voice was calm, controlled, the kind of calm that precedes storms. Robert tried to lie, then tried to minimize, finally tried to explain. Each attempt made the situation worse. Catherine listened in silence, her face a porcelain mask that revealed nothing. When they arrived home, the mansion on the Upper East Side that had been featured in decorating magazines, Catherine went straight to the bar. She served herself a generous dose of vodka, drank it in one gulp, then threw the glass against the wall. The baccarat crystal exploded into 1,000 pieces, the sound echoing through the living room, decorated with artworks worth fortunes. The argument that followed was heard by the staff, by the neighbors, probably by the entire street. Catherine wasn't a woman to scream. She had been educated in Swiss schools where self-control was a mandatory subject, but that night she screamed. She screamed about betrayal, about humiliation, about wasted years building a life with a man who had a secret family. Robert tried to explain that he didn't know about the boys, but Catherine wasn't interested in nuances. For her, the betrayal had happened 8 years ago and continued happening now. The following days were a domestic purgatory. Catherine didn't leave the house, but turned every meal into a silent battlefield. The staff walked on tiptoes, afraid of provoking another explosion. Robert slept in the guest room when he could sleep. Insomnia had become his constant companion, the early hours spent reliving every wrong decision, every cowardice. At the office, Charles smelled blood. He spread subtle rumors about Robert's instability, questioned decisions in important meetings, planted doubts in key investors. The empire that Robert had built so carefully began to show cracks. Important contracts were postponed, partners began to hesitate, stock values fluctuated. Saturday arrived like a sentence. Robert arrived at the park an hour before the agreed, time wandering the dirt paths like a ghost. When Julia appeared with the boys, his heart accelerated so much he thought he would faint. Luke and Gabriel ran ahead, exploring the playground with the infinite energy of 8-year-olds. Julia sat on the bench next to Robert, maintaining a careful distance. The initial conversation with the boys was painfully formal. Julia had prepared them explained who this man was, but reality was more complex than any explanation. Gabriel, the more extroverted one, asked direct questions that cut like razors. Why had he never appeared before? Why didn't he live with them? Did he have other children? Luke, more observant, studied Robert with eyes that saw too much, understood too much for an 8-year-old child. Robert tried to connect through gifts. He had brought latest generation tablets, expensive games, promises of trips to Disney World. Julia intervened gently but firmly. The boys weren't for sale. If Robert wanted to be part of their lives, he would have to earn that right with presence, not presence. The lesson hurt, but it was necessary. While watching the boys play, Robert had glimpses of what he had lost. The first day of school, the first steps, the first words. Luke had a birthmark on his neck identical to his. Gabriel bit his lip when concentrated, exactly like Robert did during difficult negotiations. They were his, undoubtedly his, and he had lost 8 years of their lives. Catherine discovered the meeting through photos that someone, probably some malicious acquaintance, sent anonymously. The images showed Robert at the park, clearly emotional, watching 2 children who looked just like him. The subsequent confrontation was even worse than the first. Catherine demanded impossible choices, either the family he had abandoned or the family he had built. There was no middle ground in her world of absolutes. In the following weeks, Robert tried to balance the impossible: secret meetings with the children, desperate attempts to save the marriage, increasingly risky maneuvers to keep Charles under control in business. Each battlefront demanded energy he didn't have, decisions that contradicted each other, lies that multiplied like cancer cells. Julia, for her part, faced her own battles. The boys returned from meetings with their father confused, full of questions. She didn't know how to answer. The school noticed behavioral changes. Gabriel was more aggressive, Luke more withdrawn. The life carefully built over 8 years swayed under the weight of a presence that was simultaneously necessary and destructive. The turning point came during Catherine's birthday, a black tie event for 300 guests at New York's most luxurious hotel. Robert had promised Julia he would tell Catherine the truth before the event, but cowardice won again. He appeared beside his wife, smiling for the cameras, toasting the health of their marriage, each word a betrayal to all parties involved. That's when Julia appeared. She had been invited by one of the doctors from the hospital where she worked, who was also a friend of Catherine. The cruel ironies of fate. She wore a simple but elegant dress bought especially for the occasion. She hadn't come to create problems, just to collect a debt of courage. But when she saw Robert on stage, giving a speech about love and fidelity, something inside her broke. The boys were with her. It had been a last-minute decision. The babysitter had cancelled. Her mother was sick. They wore their best suits, the ones they used for school presentations, hair carefully combed, shoes shining. They looked like little gentlemen displaced in that sea of ostentatious luxury. Catherine saw Julia first. Recognition was instantaneous. Women always know somehow, but it was the boys who confirmed her worst suspicions. Those faces were irrefutable proof, silent witnesses to a betrayal that went beyond the physical. Catherine descended from the stage with the grace of a ballerina and the determination of a general going to war. The confrontation happened in the center of the ballroom, under the immense crystal chandelier that had been imported from Venice. Catherine didn't raise her voice. That would be vulgar. Instead, each word was pronounced with surgical clarity, cutting through the air and the silence that had taken over the ballroom. 300 people watched in shock as Catherine unraveled her husband's sordid story, the mistress, the bastard children. Her words spat like poison. Julia maintained her dignity. She didn't retaliate, didn't defend herself. She just held her children's hands, who watched everything with wide eyes of fear and confusion. When Catherine finished her public accusation, Julia said only one phrase, loud enough for everyone to hear. Her children weren't to blame for the adults' mistakes. Robert finally found his voice, but it was too late. He tried to take control of the situation, guide everyone to a more private location, but Catherine wasn't finished. She demanded right there in front of everyone that he choose. The audience watched as if it were a theatrical spectacle, some even taking out their phones to film the scandal of the year. It was Gabriel who broke the impasse. The boy, with his 8 years and all the innocence that carried, walked up to Robert. His words were simple, but devastating in their childlike honesty. He didn't want a father who was ashamed of him. If Robert couldn't admit to being their father in front of everyone, then it was better to continue as it was before. The silence that followed was absolute. Robert looked at his son, and saw not just Gabriel, but also Luke, who had approached his brother in silent support. He saw Julia, who had raised those boys to have dignity even in adversity. He saw Catherine, his wife of 15 years, destroyed by public humiliation. He saw the faces of New York's elite eager for scandal. And then, for the first time in his life, Robert made the right choice. He knelt in front of the boys. There, in the middle of the ballroom, under the Venetian chandelier, before 300 people, he asked for forgiveness. Not a generic request, but specific, detailed. Forgiveness for not being present, for being a coward, for choosing money and status over love and responsibility. He assumed in a loud and clear voice that Luke and Gabriel were his children, that he was proud of them, that he wanted to be part of their lives if they allowed it. Catherine left the ballroom without saying another word, her exit followed by the flashes of dozens of phones. The next day, newspapers and gossip sites would have material for weeks. But at that moment, Robert didn't care. For the first time in 8 years, he was being honest. The boys didn't hug him, that would be asking too much. But Luke nodded slightly, and Gabriel relaxed his tense shoulders. Small gestures that meant not forgiveness but possibility. Julia guided them out of the ballroom, but before leaving, she looked at Robert. In her eyes there was no more anger, just an old sadness and the shadow of something that could be hope. In the following weeks, Robert's life methodically crumbled. Catherine asked for divorce, demanding half of everything and getting it. Charles took advantage of the scandal to attempt a business coup, forcing Robert to sell his part of the company for a fraction of its real value. Lifelong friends disappeared, replaced by looks of censure and poorly disguised whispers. But something unexpected happened in the middle of the chaos. Without the need to maintain appearances, Robert discovered a freedom he hadn't known for decades. He moved to a smaller apartment, closer to where Julia and the boys lived. He began appearing at school soccer games, at year-end presentations, at parent meetings. Luke and Gabriel were cautious at first, testing limits, asking difficult questions. Robert learned that fatherhood wasn't about DNA or money, but about consistent presence, about being there when Gabriel broke his arm skateboarding, about helping Luke with math homework, even when business meetings piled up, about sitting with Julia in endless hospital waiting rooms when the boys got sick. Julia maintained emotional distance, cordial but careful. She had built walls over 8 years, and it wouldn't be Robert's late repentance that would tear them down. But she allowed his approach with the children, recognizing that the boys needed a father, even an imperfect one. It was during a routine visit to the doctor with the boys that the second bomb exploded. The pediatrician, doing routine exams, suggested genetic tests to map possible hereditary conditions. The results revealed something Julia had hidden for 8 years. The twins had a sister. The confession came on a Sunday afternoon after the boys went to sleep. Julia told the story through tears she hadn't shed in years. The pregnancy had been triplets, 3 babies, premature, fighting for life in the NICU. The cost was impossible, even with the precarious health plan she had. Desperation led her to an impossible decision: give one of the girls up for adoption to a couple who could give her the necessary medical care. Sophia, she had named her before giving her up, was born with heart problems that required surgeries Julia could never afford. The adoptive couple were doctors, had resources, promised to take care of her. It was the most difficult decision of Julia's life, one that haunted her every night. She had followed Sophia from a distance through annual medical reports the couple sent until they moved abroad when the girl was 3 years old. Robert listened to everything in silence, the weight of each revelation adding layers to his already unbearable guilt. If he had been present, if he had taken responsibility, Julia would never have had to make that impossible choice. 3 children. He had 3 children and had failed them all in different ways. The search for Sophia began discreetly. Robert used his remaining contacts, private investigators, lawyers specializing in adoption. Julia was torn between the hope of reuniting with her daughter and the fear of destroying the life she had built with the adoptive family. The boys didn't know about their sister's existence, another secret that weighed in the air between the adults. It took 3 months to find her. Sophia, now called Sophie, lived in Toronto with her adoptive parents. She was 8 years old, healthy after multiple successful surgeries, played piano, spoke 3 languages. Photos obtained by the investigator showed a happy, smiling girl, clearly loved. She had Julia's eyes and Robert's determined chin. The ethical dilemma was devastating. Did they have the right to appear in her life? To destroy the narrative the adoptive parents had built? Sophie believed she was an only child, born premature but loved from the first day. The truth could destroy her carefully constructed world. It was Luke who forced the decision. The boy, always observant, had noticed the whispered conversations, the tense looks between adults. One night he confronted Robert directly. Were there more secrets? Robert, who had promised never to lie to his children again, told the truth. The twins' reaction was complex. Gabriel was furious, with his mother for hiding, with his father for causing everything, with the universe for the injustice. Luke was quiet for days, processing the information with his characteristic intensity. Finally, both came to the same conclusion. They wanted to meet their sister. The approach was made through lawyers with extreme care. Sophie's adoptive parents, David and Marie Leclerc, were decent people who had loved and cared for Sophie as promised. The initial meeting was only between adults, in a law office in Toronto, neutral and professional. Marie cried throughout the meeting. David remained stoic, but his eyes revealed the fear of losing the daughter they had raised. Julia had to leave the room several times, unable to process gratitude and pain simultaneously. Robert, surprisingly, was the one who kept everyone focused on what mattered: Sophie's well-being. They agreed on a gradual approach. First, Sophie would be informed about her biological origin. Then, if she wanted, she would meet her brothers. The biological parents would come last if Sophie chose to meet them. Everything in her time, respecting her feelings and emotional stability. The video conference where Sophie met Luke and Gabriel was a moment of tension and magic. The three studied each other through the screen, looking for similarities, differences, connections. Sophie was more delicate than the boys, but had the same nose, the same way of tilting her head when curious. They talked about school, hobbies, favorite foods, superficial conversations that carried the weight of 8 years of separation. The virtual meetings became weekly. The three siblings developed their own language, inside jokes, complicity, that transcended physical distance. Sophie began learning Spanish, adapted for an American context. The boys practiced English. Julia and Marie began exchanging messages, two mothers united by love for the same children. The first in-person meeting happened 6 months later, on neutral territory, Orlando, during school vacation. Seeing the three together for the first time was devastating and healing simultaneously. Sophie was clearly a Williams. She had the same way of gesturing as Gabriel, the same observant intensity as Luke. But she was also a Leclerc, with mannerisms and expressions she had learned from the parents who raised her. The two families spent a week together, navigating the complexity of their unique situation. There was no manual for this, no precedent to follow. Each day brought new challenges and small victories. David and Robert found common ground in their love for the children. Marie and Julia shared stories from the early years, filling gaps in each child's history. The boys were surprisingly mature about the situation. Luke especially demonstrated emotional understanding beyond his years, often serving as mediator when tensions arose. Gabriel, more impulsive, sometimes asked uncomfortable questions that adults would prefer to avoid, but his brutal honesty often catalyzed necessary conversations. Sophie struggled with identity issues. She loved the parents who raised her, but also felt an undeniable connection with her biological siblings. During a beach walk, she confessed to Julia that she had always felt something was missing, a void she now understood. Julia held the daughter she had given up, both crying for the simultaneous loss and reunion. Robert watched everything with a mixture of gratitude and regret. Each moment with the three children together was a reminder of what could have been. But he was also learning that paralyzing regret served no one. What mattered was the present and how to build a better future. The decision on how to proceed came naturally. There would be no custody battle, no attempt to undo what was done. Instead, they created an expanded family, irregular but functional. Sophie would continue living with the Leclercs in Toronto, but would spend holidays with her siblings in New York. Luke and Gabriel would visit Canada. The two families would become one, united not by law or convention, but by choice and love. Catherine watched everything from a distance, through social news and occasional gossip. The divorce had been finalized. She had received her share and rebuilt her life. She married again to a widowed diplomat, moved to Paris, reinvented herself as a patron of the arts. But sometimes, late at night, she wondered about the woman she had been married to a man she never really knew. Charles Mendoza had his moment of triumph by forcing Robert out of the company, but the victory was hollow. Without Robert's strategic vision, the company began to decline. Hasty decisions, poorly calculated investments, the loss of key clients who respected Robert more than the company itself. In 2 years, Charles was selling his share for less than he had paid Robert, the irony not lost on anyone following the situation. Robert rebuilt his career differently. Instead of pursuing power at any cost, he created a boutique consultancy, working only with companies whose values aligned with his. Renewed principles, he earned less but slept better. The Upper East Side mansion was replaced by a comfortable but modest house in a family neighborhood, with space for the 3 children when they visited him. Julia maintained her fierce independence. She continued working as a nurse, refusing repeated offers from Robert for financial help, beyond the legally established child support for the boys. She had survived 8 years alone. She didn't need to be rescued now. But gradually, the walls she had built began to show cracks. It was during a medical emergency with Gabriel, acute appendicitis in the middle of the night, that something changed between them. Robert arrived at the hospital minutes after Julia, having broken all speed limits. They stayed together during the surgery, sharing the fear that only parents understand. When Gabriel woke up from anesthesia and smiled seeing both of them there, something healed between them. Not romantic love, that had died long ago, but a partnership born from shared love for their children. Luke developed a passion for science, especially astronomy. Robert and Julia took turns taking him to the municipal observatory, listening to his enthusiastic explanations about constellations and planets. During one of these visits, Luke said something that stayed with Robert forever. The universe was too big to waste time on small regrets. Gabriel discovered his talent for music. He started with an old guitar that David Leclerc sent from Canada, evolved to composition. His songs, melancholic but hopeful, told stories of broken families finding ways to reconnect. Sophie played piano on some home recordings. Luke created videos, a transcontinental collaboration that united the siblings through art. Sophie visited the United States for the first time the following Christmas. Seeing the house where she could have grown up, meeting her biological grandmother, Mrs. Carmen, who cried for hours embracing her granddaughter, was overwhelming and healing. She fit into the family dynamic as if she had always been there, even though everyone knew she would return to Toronto in 2 weeks. During this visit, Sophie asked a question no one had dared ask. Could Robert and Julia have stayed together if he had known about the pregnancy? The silence that followed was heavy but necessary. Robert admitted he probably wouldn't have. He'd been too cowardly, too trapped by family expectations. Julia agreed that the Robert of that time wasn't ready to be a father or partner. The man he had become through pain and growth was different from the privileged boy who had abandoned her. Marie and David Leclerc became an integral part of the expanded family. They were Sophie's parents in every sense that mattered, and no one questioned that. During a visit to New York, David and Robert had a long conversation about fatherhood, about the privilege and responsibility of raising these 3 extraordinary human beings. Marie and Julia created a WhatsApp group where they shared photos, concerns, small and big victories. Life established a new rhythm. It wasn't conventional, would certainly generate looks and comments, but it worked. Birthdays were celebrated via video conference when they couldn't be together physically. Report. Cards were shared among 4 parents, Important decisions were discussed in family council that included voices from two countries. Robert learned to cook, something he had never needed to do in his previous life. His first attempts were disastrous, but the boys laughed and ate. Anyway, Julia sometimes appeared for dinner on these occasions, bringing dessert, gently correcting Robert's most serious mistakes in the kitchen. They were moments of domestic normalcy he had never valued before. During a parent meeting at the Hyde Set boys' school, Robert heard two other fathers commenting about that family's scandalous situation. Before, he would have been mortified, worried about his image. Now he simply approached and introduced himself cordially, making it clear he was proud of his children and the unconventional family they had built. The men fell into embarrassed silence, but some mothers approached afterward, sharing their own stories of rebuilt families. Luke won a scholarship to a young scientists program. During the award ceremony, he thanked his parents, plural without qualifiers. On stage, he explained he was lucky to have 4 adults who loved and supported him, even though the configuration was non-traditional. The auditorium applauded, some with tears in their eyes. Gabriel began giving small shows at local cafes. Robert, Julia, Luke, and even Catherine, who was visiting New York, appeared at one of these presentations. It was strange, everyone admitted afterward, but also strangely right. Gabriel's song spoke about forgiveness, about families that break and rebuild in different forms, about love that survives even when it changes form. Sophie decided she wanted to spend a year in the United States when she turned 15. The Leclercs supported, understanding she needed to know this part of herself. Preparations for this extended stay further united the two families with discussions about school, housing, logistics that would be impossible without everyone's cooperation. Robert developed a special relationship with each child. With Luke, it was the early mornings watching stars and discussing infinity. With Gabriel, it was the afternoons writing songs together, Robert contributing lyrics based on his experience of loss and redemption. With Sophie, it was long video conversations about books. She had inherited the love of reading that Robert had forgotten he had. Julia began dating a colleague doctor, a widower with a teenage daughter. Robert felt jealous, which he had no right to feel, but learned to process the emotion without acting on it. He even helped the boys accept the situation, explaining their mother deserved to be happy, deserved a partner who would choose her completely, something he had failed to do. Julia's new boyfriend, Fernando, was a good man who understood from the beginning the complexity of the situation. He didn't try to replace Robert as father, nor compete for affection. Instead, he became another positive adult figure in the boys' lives, further expanding the circle of love and support around them. During a family barbecue, an event that now included Julia, Fernando, his daughter, Robert, the 3 children, and even the Leclercs who were visiting, someone took a photo. Later, looking at the image, Robert saw not a broken family, but an expanded family. Not conventional, certainly complicated, but united by conscious choices of love and forgiveness. Robert's business prospered modestly but consistently. He was no longer the magnate who appeared on magazine covers, but had loyal clients who valued his renewed integrity. He used his reduced but real influence for causes that mattered: educational programs for underprivileged children, support for single mothers, scholarships for talented young people without resources. Luke, at 16, published his first scientific article in an international student journal. Gabriel recorded his first independent album at 15. Sophie was accepted into a young writers program at 14. 3 children who could have been statistics of a destroyed family had become examples of resilience and success. The most significant moment came during Fernando and Julia's wedding, 3 years after that first encounter at the bus stop. Robert was there, not as a bitter ex-husband, but as the father of his children, an integral part of this unconventional family. During his toast, he spoke about second chances, about families that form not just by blood or paper, but by daily choice to show up, to try, to forgive. Catherine sent a wedding gift from Paris, an antique crystal vase that had belonged to Julia's grandmother, something Catherine had kept all these years without knowing why. The card simply said, "To new beginnings." It was her way of making peace with the past, of recognizing that everyone had changed, had grown. Sophie spent her year in the United States, living part with Robert, part with Julia and Fernando. The experience transformed her, giving her a deeper understanding of her complex identity. She wrote about it for her college application, about being a bridge between worlds, about belonging to multiple places simultaneously. During Luke's high school graduation, the entire expanded family was present. The Leclercs flew from Canada. Catherine sent a congratulations video from Paris. Fernando filmed everything while Julia cried discreetly. Robert watched his son receive the Best Student Award, knowing he had lost much, but also gained a second chance to do things right. Gabriel decided to study music production in Toronto, staying close to Sophie while she finished high school. The siblings developed an even deeper complicity, supporting each other through the challenges of adolescence. Luke visited frequently, the three siblings exploring the city together, creating memories that partially compensated for the lost years. Robert and Julia developed a genuine friendship. It wasn't romance. Both knew that chapter had ended definitively, but it was something valuable. Two people who shared extraordinary children, who had learned to forgive each other and themselves. During a casual coffee, while waiting for Luke to finish an exam, Julia said something that summed it all up. They had failed as a couple but were succeeding as a family. The true measure of this rebuilt family's success came during a crisis. Mrs. Carmen, Julia's mother, had a stroke. The entire family mobilized. Robert used his contacts to get the best doctors. The Leclercs flew from Canada with Sophie. Fernando coordinated medical care. The three grandchildren took turns at the hospital, reading to their great-grandmother, playing music, simply being present. Mrs. Carmen recovered partially enough to see the three grandchildren together, to definitively forgive Robert, to bless Julia's marriage to Fernando. On her 80th birthday, she was surrounded not just by her blood family, but by this chosen, expanded, imperfect, but real family. Years passed. Luke entered MIT to study astrophysics. Gabriel signed with a respected independent record label. Sophie was accepted to Harvard to study comparative literature. 3 different paths, 3 bright futures born from a complicated past. Robert, now 50 years old, was fundamentally different from the man who had stopped at that fateful traffic light. The graying temples, the lines around his eyes told stories of sleepless nights, fatherly worries, unexpected joys. He was no longer rich in money, but was rich in ways he had never imagined possible. During Robert's 50th birthday, the party was modest but meaningful, not at a luxury hotel but in the backyard of the house where he now lived. Luke flew from Boston, Gabriel from Los Angeles where he was recording, Sophie from Cambridge. Julia and Fernando were there, Marie and David, too. Even Catherine sent a bottle of vintage champagne with an affectionate note. When Robert blew out the candles, he didn't ask for anything. For the first time in his adult life, he had everything that really mattered. It wasn't the life he had. Planned certainly wasn't conventional, but it was authentically his. The true plot twist of the story wasn't the discovery of the third daughter or the public scandal. It was the discovery that families can be rebuilt in unexpected ways, that love can survive even when it changes form, that forgiveness is possible even when it seems impossible. Years later, when grandchildren began to arrive, first from Luke and his astronomer wife, then from Sophie and her poet husband, finally from Gabriel and his conductor partner, the expanded family grew even more. Children who called Robert Grandpa, Julia Grandma, the Leclercs Grand-Mère and Grand-Père, Fernando Grandpa Nando, in a loving babel of languages and affections that defied any attempt at traditional categorization. During a family reunion, with 3 generations present, someone asked Robert if he would change anything, if he could go back in time. He thought long before answering. Yes, he would have been brave from the beginning. He would have taken responsibility. He would have chosen love over fear. But then he looked around, at his successful adult children, at the grandchildren playing in the garden, at this impossible but real family, and realized that every mistake had led to this moment. The story didn't have a fairy tale ending in the traditional sense. Robert and Julia didn't get back together. Catherine didn't completely forgive. Some wounds left permanent scars. But it was a real ending, human, where imperfect people did the best they could with the cards life had dealt them. Robert's legacy wouldn't be a business empire or a fortune in Swiss banks. It would be 3 children who learned that family is more about choice than blood, that forgiveness is possible, that love can take many forms. It would be grandchildren who would grow up knowing there isn't just one right way to be a family. In Sapri, the end, the lesson was simple but profound. We can't change the past, but we can choose how to respond to it. Robert had spent the first half of his life running from responsibilities. He spent the second half embracing them, and in that embrace, imperfect and late as it was, he found redemption. Life continued, as it always continues. Ordinary days, punctuated by extraordinary moments. Video calls connecting continents, text messages sharing small and big achievements, family photos that needed panoramic view to include everyone. A complex tapestry of relationships that defied definition, but worked because everyone chose daily to make it work. Robert died at 73, surrounded by all his children, grandchildren, and the expanded family he had helped create. His last words were of gratitude, not for the empire he had lost, but for the family he had found. Julia held his hand at the end, Fernando on the other side, the children around the bed, a scene that would have been impossible to imagine on that day at the traffic light, but which became the final testament that redemption is possible, that families can be rebuilt, that love finds ways to survive even when everything seems lost. The funeral was a celebration of a life that had been lived in 2 distinct acts. The first, a tragedy of lost opportunities. The second, a story of redemption and reconstruction. People from all aspects of his life attended, from former business partners to school staff of the grandchildren, all touched somehow by Robert's transformation. Gabriel composed and played a special song for the occasion. Luke gave a speech about how his father had taught him, "It's never too late to change." Sophie read a poem about families that break and reform like light, passing through a prism, creating something more beautiful in the fragmentation. Robert's headstone didn't mention his business successes. Instead, it said simply, "Father, grandfather, proof that second chances exist." And so the story that began with a man paralyzed by fear at a traffic light ended with a legacy of courage, forgiveness, and unconventional love. It wasn't an easy or clean journey, but it was real. And sometimes, imperfect reality is more beautiful than any fairy tale.